Subcommittee on Economic Development and Natural Resources. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, Senator Locke was going to be joining us, as she will likely be on the MEI, and that being related to those big employment kinds of situations, it will be important for her to get updated on this. But Charles, if she doesn't make it onto the call, if you could maybe set up a time where either you or Stephen or the both of you can brief Senator Locke and perhaps Senator Sasloff, if he doesn't make it onto the call, and give them the kind of the rundown, because I think this is going to be a pretty key thing going into our next session, given the uncertainty of our revenue situation. Business development will take on an even greater urgency. I want to thank the subcommittee members for your hard work this year during the 2020 session. Unfortunately, as you know, while we're finalizing the budget in mid-March, the spread of the novel coronavirus was accelerating into a global pandemic. And in order to safeguard the health of our citizens and slow the rate of infection, many of our businesses in the Commonwealth have needed to close temporarily, or in some cases, operate at partial capacity. I tell you, just from a personal standpoint, it's been heartbreaking to talk to these small business owners who are desperate to get back open again, and knowing that you're going to bring back employees, and you're going to go through a lot of expense, and maybe people show up and maybe they don't. As many people as want to get the Commonwealth up and running and reopen, there are those who are much more cautious. So it'll be interesting to see as we get to phase 3 how things go. While it was necessary to close down in a number of respects, this disruption in business activity has resulted in significant loss of tax revenue to the state, which is projected to continue into the next biennium. As a result, you will recall that the General Assembly adopted a number of budget amendments in the April reconvened session, which effectively froze spending that was included in the adopted budget. In fact, the areas under this subcommittee's purview, the Secretariats of Commerce and Trade and Agriculture and Forestry and Natural Resources, more than $200 million in funding was unallotted. I know the members of this subcommittee are eager to get back to work on the budget. We will all look forward to convening in special session and making the necessary responsible budget adjustments that reflect the priorities of the Senate while being responsive to the public health emergency and in this challenging economic environment. However, it will not be until the close of the current fiscal year that we will begin to consider additional budget actions with a clearer understanding of the impact that COVID-19 will have on the state's resources. I understand from our last meeting is that it was not quite as bad as was anticipated, and the number being tossed around at that point in time for the next fiscal year would be about an $800 million shortfall. I think is that still the latest in thinking, Charles?
Mr. Chairman, I recall that the Secretary originally had said that it would be on the order of $1 billion, but at the last meeting, as you said, he indicated it was going to be somewhat less than that. I believe it was in the $750 to $800 million range, but I could be wrong on that. I don't have the precise number on my fingertips.
Okay, very good. Well, today I've asked Stephen Murray, President and CEO of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, to provide an informational briefing on the Commonwealth's economic development activities, including an overview of how potential economic development projects are identified and considered for taxpayer-funded incentives, and how incentive awards are monitored to ensure that the Commonwealth receive a positive return on its investment. And to be clear, the purpose of today's discussion is not to entertain requests for funding. Rather, the intent for today's meeting is to be informational only. And I've had an opportunity to get involved in a couple of these endeavors. One that I've been working with Will Moorfield in dealing with the Secretary of Commerce on the Tazewell County Fish Farm. And I don't know the current status on that, but I think the Secretary of Commerce was favorable towards that. And the second thing is I've had two conference calls with Stephen Murray and Brian Ball and the folks at Commerce and Housing, as well as one with Secretary Kiana Carter and her folks, around a 5G project, which we're trying to figure out right now just how to move that forward, whether it's an unsolicited proposal or whether the Commonwealth can run with it. But it would be focused around DGS, making rooftops or finding a way to make rooftops of Commonwealth buildings and local government buildings and schools available for a 5G project that would bring, I think, could bring considerable revenue to the Commonwealth, while at the same time advancing our internet goals and expansion of broadband in rural areas. So it's been very educational for me to get involved in some of these projects. But with that, let me turn it over to Stephen to begin his presentation on what's going on at VEDP. Stephen, take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon at a very awkward time for the Commonwealth, but a time where economic development has never been more important. Delighted today was to share with you kind of an overview of how we do our work at VEDP, focused on economic development in Virginia, with a particular focus on incentives administration, as the chairman indicated. And this will probably be about 30 minutes, and then would be happy to take any questions, or happy to take any questions along the way as well. So, sorry about that. So first of all, there's a lot of different ways to think about what economic development is, but broadly speaking, at least at VEDP, we think of it as policies and programs designed to encourage growth in jobs, wages, and investment. That is the ultimate goal that we're seeking to achieve. But there are, of course, a variety of activities that go into making that happen. So, for example, marketing. One of the most important things we do, in fact, the very first activity referenced as a responsibility of VEDP in the Code of Virginia, is to market the Commonwealth and make the broad national and global business community aware of the advantages that we have for business, because obviously that often impacts the number of companies willing to consider Virginia. Second is recruiting out-of-state firms that are not yet in the Commonwealth to consider creating new projects here. These are projects that would primarily serve out-of-state customers. So they're bringing in new revenues, new jobs, new sales opportunities for small businesses. Third is to help retain and grow the companies that are already here today. Most of the projects that we work on at VEDP, while you think of sort of the HQ2s of the world, the reality is most of the work we do is actually relatively small expansions of existing firms, and we have project managers that work with them. Fourth is trade development. We have one of the best, arguably the best trade development team, state-level trade development team in the country. We work with hundreds of companies a year to help them get into international sales, or if they're already selling into other markets, to expand their sales to new markets or increase sales in the markets that they're in. A really important part of the work that we do is collaboration or coordination with other entities, from the General Assembly to the administration to local and regional economic development groups, trade associations, and others. When you think about the name of VEDP, one of the things I liked right off the bat when I was looking at the CEO job was the name of the organization, the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, because that word partnership really captures the essence of what economic development is all about. Another key function that we play is helping to recommend economic development policies and strategies to position Virginia and its regions for growth. We do a lot of benchmarking of public policies, of business climate rankings, and so forth, and we share that with the administration and the General Assembly from time to time. And one of the important functions also is research. When we are working to attract new investment to Virginia or encouraging existing companies to grow, we often have to make the case in a fact-based way for why a particular project would fit well in the Commonwealth. We have to do that quickly. We look at available sites, we look at infrastructure issues, we often coordinate with other agencies on that. We do labor force analytics, we do a whole range of things to help make the case in a really analytical and robust way for Virginia. One of the key focus areas for us, and one of the key focus areas of the VEDP reform in 2017, was incentives administration. That's been a big focus. I'm going to talk about that today. We don't administer all the incentives in Virginia, but for those that we do administer, we try to do it very well in a very transparent way, where we're publicly reporting performance, where we hold companies accountable to deliver on their commitments or to pay us back proportionate to any underperformance, and then of course report on all that. Second to last is all about workforce. When you think about the future of economic development, it is more than anything about talent. It's about the supply of highly capable, well-trained, productive workers. We do that. We support companies in those efforts through both grants, the VGIP program, or through complete custom workforce solutions that we develop and deliver in collaboration with the Virginia Community College System with our Virginia Talent Accelerator program. And finally, we collaborate with locality partners to help identify and cultivate project-ready sites. There are a lot of other things that VDP does in the Commonwealth, but this really captures the essence of the major functions of the organization. And for several of these, I'm going to go into greater detail today. Let's see. So let me chat a bit. I mentioned that word partnership. We literally work with hundreds of in-state partners. In fact, we have more than 1,000 individuals and organizations that we stay in regular contact with. Certainly, most importantly, the administration of the General Assembly, but right after that, our local and regional partners across the Commonwealth. There are several hundred economic development professionals across Virginia that we work with. We interact regularly with utilities, railroads, trade associations, and others. I've also listed some of the state agencies that we work with in Virginia. I should also mention, of course, the Port of Virginia, very common partner for us. And a typical day, we're working with some other state agency on a project. So that partnership piece is really, really critical. Oops, sorry about that. One of the first concepts that I really wanted to share with you all to really ground us in the work that we're doing is the notion of traded sector versus non-traded sector. This is a really important concept to understand when you think about economic development. Traded sector is basically all the businesses that generate most of their sales, most of their customers from out of state. They're bringing in those revenues, they're bringing in jobs to Virginia. Roughly a third of our employment in Virginia is in the traded sector. Think about corporate headquarters, manufacturers, technology businesses, most of them business process outsourcing, supply chain. Those really represent about a third of the economy. That 1/3 drives the entire economy. All those other small businesses in the quote non-traded sector are also very important, but they would not be able to have the level of employment but for the traded sector, because that's bringing in all that wealth. The non-traded sector, typically you think of things like retail, restaurants, most hospitals, entertainment venues, local services. These are businesses that really live off of the local population and the local businesses that are there. If a traded sector business closes down, that means less sales for small businesses. If most small businesses that are in the non-traded sector, if one of those closes down, it means probably another small business will expand to pick up that demand. I wanted to give you an example here using some real numbers. So again, we're just talking traded sector. So traded sector example, let's imagine a manufacturer like a plastic resin manufacturer. For every one job that company creates, like think of that as an on-site, W-2 employee, roughly 1.2 indirect jobs are created in the broader region, typically through suppliers to the company, and roughly 2.2 induced jobs where the employees actually spend money, like local retailers, like restaurants, rentals, and so forth. So overall, for every 1.1 job, you get about 4.4 total jobs. So if we had a 25 job manufacturer, we get 110 total jobs in Virginia. Now, we don't often put this in our press releases, but when you think about anytime you see an announcement that VDP is associated with, that direct job is just one piece of the story. Usually there's multiple additional indirect and induced jobs that are going to be created once that company ramps up. In contrast, if we look at a non-traded sector project, so let's say just a restaurant, typical restaurant has, again, for every direct job, in this case, it's only a tenth of an indirect job, 2/10 of an induced job for a total of 1.3. Or if you have a 25 job restaurant, you only end up with 32.5 total jobs in the Virginia economy. So this really helps to speak to a couple things. One, why we focus on the traded sector, because there's so much of an additional impact for every job that's created. But it's also because the reason that impact is there, or the result of that impact, is more sales for small businesses across Virginia. So even though you don't think of VDP typically as an agency that interacts a lot with small businesses, although we do to a degree through our trade development team, they are the primary beneficiary actually of the work that we do because of all those additional sales coming into the Commonwealth. As we do our work and we think about the traded sector, we've done a lot of research and analysis over the years to try to understand which industry sectors we can be most competitive for. And here you see the primary ones that we go after. I won't list all these out, but you can sort of imagine if you look at the announcements, you can think of over the last 2 or 3 years, certainly most of those have been in one of these targets. These are all traded sectors. These are all targets where we think in some cases, all of Virginia, in some cases, a subset of Virginia can be competitive. And it also helps us to really shape our messaging to make sure that we're focusing on what are the strengths that we have for each industry. Let's see. So one thing to keep in mind as you think about our work is that the industry mix in each region is very different. Several of you, for example, are in Northern Virginia. If you look over the last few years, the majority of new jobs we've announced in Northern Virginia, in fact, nearly all of them have been either in technology or headquarters type projects, overwhelmingly that. When you look at the rest of the state, technology tends to be a smaller amount with the exception of maybe Charlottesville, and you start to see this much bigger factor with manufacturing, in particular Southern Virginia, where Senator Ruff is based, Southwest Virginia, Shenandoah Valley, Roanoke, the Valley, of course, where Senator Hanger is based. Manufacturing really becomes a really very important driver across most of those regions, particularly outside of the Crescent. So it's something to keep in mind as we do our work. We certainly go after all those industry sectors, but when you really think about where the jobs are coming from, it really varies quite a bit by region. And so we really try to be sensitive to that. So one of the things I wanted to mention that sort of also gives you a little bit of insight in terms of helping you understand our work is how the media, and none of this is intentional, but because the big projects tend to get all the attention, I think the perception often is that VDP is just focused on things like Amazon HQ2 or Micron or Fortune 1000 headquarters. And we are excited about those, and we do put a lot of energy into those. So that's, this left hand here you see is the typical front page story that you might get when you announce one of those, or Morgan Olson or something like that. But more typically, a typical VDP project, last time I checked, was a 50 job expansion of an existing company. In fact, 2/3 of our projects are actually working with companies that are already in Virginia, helping them grow. But what happens is when we announce one of those projects, usually it shows up on maybe A3 or B6, if you will, depending on the newspaper. They just don't get the same level of attention. So one of the things I would hope that you all would think about as you think about our work is, yes, we do work on the Amazons of the world, and we're super excited about that and what they're doing. But most of our work is actually with existing Virginia companies where we're encouraging them to expand. So 3 years ago, under the direction of the General Assembly with VDP reform, we were pushed to, or required, I should say, to create a comprehensive strategic plan for economic development of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we did that working in close collaboration with hundreds of local, regional, and state partners. The guiding force, or the sort of the North Star of that plan, was really this notion of 5 transformational goals. These are goals that are broadly embraced by almost all of our partners, state, regional, and local levels. So I wanted to take just a moment to share with you what those goals are, and then briefly how we're doing against those, because we are making progress, but we got a ways to go. So the thumbnail sketch, robust state growth, getting back to, you remember in the recession and under BRAC, we'd really slowed down. We want to get back to top 5 to 10 growth. We want every region of Virginia to participate in the growth of Virginia. We don't want to just have 1 or 2 regions driving all the growth, others in negative territory, which has actually happened a lot of past years. Third, we want to be viewed as one of the very best states for business in the country, not just on the CNBC ranking, but overall. There's a variety of other rankings. We want to be one of the top performing state economic development organizations in the country, and we want to be a super collaborator. Again, thinking back to that notion of partnership, Virginia Economic Development Partnership. There's an awful lot of activities, a lot of employees, but ultimately these are the 5 things that we are driven by. Every day we think about how can we better do our work to help Virginia achieve these goals. I want to just take a minute to talk about each of these. So first of all, that idea of robust growth is that over the next several years, we position Virginia to once again grow among the top 5 to 10 states. And here we're talking about percentage growth in employment and growth in median earned income. If you look at where we were the last 5 years before we did that strategic plan, we were ranked well below average, 36th in employment growth, 42nd in growth in gross state product. The next 5 years, and I think this is either latest or was recently pulled, we're right at the average. So we've gotten better, but make no mistake, we're not yet back to being the top 10, but we are headed in the right direction. Now, second key goal, and this is actually the toughest of the 5 goals, and that is to ensure that every region participates and the growth of the Commonwealth. I'm going to show you a little historical data here. So if you look at the 10 years before we had finalized that plan, and this is just employment change over 10 years, you can see we had several regions in positive territory, but most of the geography of the Commonwealth, or roughly half or more, was in negative territory. It actually experienced employment losses, of course, well-known Southern Virginia, Southwest Virginia, but also some other parts of the Eastern Shore, Northern Neck, Middle Peninsula. Now, once a couple years went by, we started to look at a better outlook. You had most of the Commonwealth projected by Moody's to be in positive territory, but still some regions in negative territory. I want to put this in context for a moment for you. This may be a statistic you'll remember. I asked our team, we have access to basically a fairly comprehensive database of all the economic development projects announced in America every year. And I asked them to look at just the new projects, not expansions, but just new locations of traded sector businesses. And what we found was in Virginia and in the United States overall, 4 out of 5 localities don't get a single new project in any one year. Like, just think about that. So if you think about Virginia, I forget the exact numbers, but let's say order of magnitude, 100 or so localities would not get a single new project in an entire year. And that is typical of the country as a whole. So it really gets at how difficult this challenge is. It also relates to why we've really selected to focus on regions rather than just localities, because if someone is able to get a job in an adjoining locality, as long as they have transportation, that is an opportunity for them. So we really focused at the regional level. Unfortunately, in the wake of the pandemic, these are the latest forecasts for the next few years. You can see that there is an anticipation that much of our geography is going to go negative. Mostly it's not so much they're losing jobs from this point forward, but rather not fully recovering what they lost during the pandemic era. If I was to show you a map of the U.S., it would look very similar to this in each state, where you would essentially see, in most cases, the metro areas tended to or expected to fully recover and be back in positive territory. Most of the smaller metros and especially the rural regions are not. So the General Assembly and VDP and the governor and others have been doing some really powerful things to try to make a difference, from broadband investment to investing in prepared sites and a variety of other things. But it's going to take an awful lot more to really achieve that goal of getting every region in positive territory. Third is getting Virginia back to being, in reality and perception, being viewed as one of the top states for business in the country. A few years ago, you may remember about 10 years ago, we were number 1 in Forbes, number 1 in CNBC, in fact, typically in the top 3 or so in every major national business climate ranking. But since then, we actually fell to a low of roughly number 11. So you think about CNBC, but there's also Forbes, Site Selection, Chief Executive Magazine. There's a number of other rankings. I think this chart is the top 5 for the average. So fortunately, since 2015, we have been on a nice improvement curve. We've gotten back to roughly number 6, including a number 1 ranking for CNBC last year, but we still have a ways to go to really get to the top 3 or so on a consistent basis. You can see back in 2010, we were actually ahead of North Carolina and Georgia. Over the succeeding 5 years or so, we actually fell well below both of those states. In the last few years, we closed the gap with Georgia. We're still a few steps behind North Carolina on average. So there still is some more work to do. We haven't talked about it a lot with the General Assembly, although we talked about it some, but we actually have analyzed all the reasons why these gaps are there and what it would take to close the gaps. We could talk about that perhaps at some other time. I did want to briefly just touch on what is it that really drives our standing in economic development. Again, we may not be number 1 overall, but overall, we are one of the more attractive places to do business in the country. By far, the number 1 strength of Virginia is talent and education. We are roughly the fifth most educated state in the country in terms of bachelor's and above attainment among the 50 states. We have the best public schools in the South, 4th rated in the country, not roughly, the best higher ed system in the South and one of the best in the country. So that's really big. And fortunately, that plays really well into where economic development is going, where it's going to be more and more talent focused. But some other key factors: quality of life, our mid-Atlantic location, a natural deep water port, fiscal stewardship of Virginia, diverse economic base, and also, very importantly, Virginia is not generally viewed as one of the most crazy pro-business states, but we are viewed as a state that it has a very stable, attractive business climate, very stable and relatively attractive tax structures. Those are some of the long-standing strengths. In recent years, there have been some additional improvements. Obviously, as you all know, you've invested in rural broadband, Fast Forward program. We launched what is now the best custom workforce program in the country, the Virginia Talent Accelerator program. We don't yet have the #1 ranking, but we're going to get it pretty soon, the next 2 or 3 years. We started marketing Virginia again. You invested in the Tech Talent Investment Program, by far the most compelling and significant tech talent investment initiative in the country. There were some targeted legal climate improvements, the port investments, infrastructure investments, and the improved economic outlook. So a lot of good things happening the last few years. And then most recently, even more, the advancements in early childhood education, the investments in site characterization, really laying the groundwork for more site development. Some of the other opportunities for the future are implementing the international trade plan, continuing the work on broadband to really get to ubiquitous or near ubiquitous broadband. G3, very strategic initiative, moving the custom workforce program to be really statewide, and of course a comprehensive marketing effort. We essentially have the full blueprint in place as a state, beyond, I would argue, where any other state is. It's really just a matter of execution from this point forward. We got an awful lot to build on. So the outlook overall is quite good. So moving number 4, we talked about making BDP one of the most effective state EDOs in the country. We've, of course, successfully implemented substantially all the JLARC recommendations. We've roughly doubled lead generation since FY17. That was a key priority for partners. We have what I believe is the best European business development office for a state EDO in the country. And last year, we were really honored to be named the most competitive state economic development organization in America by Site Selection. Now, we were excited about that. We were honored by that. But if you ask me today, we definitely don't feel like we're yet, fully as good as we can be. We think there's a lot of room for improvement. And I'm not going to dwell on this today, but what I wanted you to know is that we've been doing for the last 3 years, one of the things that we've done is to really benchmark ourselves against the national leading organizations across all these different economic development capabilities, everything from our site database and online real estate data to our trade development team to statutory incentives and beyond. What you see on the screen is, think of it as 0 would mean we don't do this at all. 100% means we set the bar. There's no other room for improvement. We're the world leader, basically. The gray bars represent where we were in 2017. The blue represents the improvement since then. So pretty much across the board, we've had significant improvement. But what you also see is there's still some significant gaps between, some cases we actually think we're a little bit below average. In other cases, we're above average, but not a lot. So we actually have an action plan for all of these things. We're able to make some steady progress each year. We don't have time to go into it in great detail today, but I just wanted you to know we've really thought through this carefully. And finally, that notion of collaboration and partnership. We do our work in collaboration with all these other entities, most importantly, the General Assembly and the administration. But on a day-to-day basis, it's really working with our local and regional partners on lead generation, on retention expansion projects, on responding to RFIs and so forth. And then there's a variety of other strategic partners like trade associations, railroads, utilities, and so forth that we work with regularly. So whenever you see an announcement associated with VDP, don't think of VDP as the entity, fully responsible for that. Think of us as a key part of the team, but that team is often typically made up of several, if not dozens, if not hundreds of individuals. As an example, when we did, of course, an extreme example, but when we did the HQ2 project, we had close to 500 individual contributors to that project, of which VDP was only a couple dozen or so. So it really is a team effort, and we try to do our part as best we can. So moving on, I wanted to give you a feel for our activities, just a sense for kind of a range. It's hard to take it all in at once, but just a little bit of a snapshot. So first of all, typical year by the numbers. Obviously, announcements, a big part of what we do in a typical year might be about 13,000 new jobs committed from VDP-assisted announcements, several $1 billion in capital investment. We'd work with hundreds of companies to get into or expand their international sales, and often you're seeing close to 800 million or so of VDP-assisted firms in terms of their international sales activity. We regularly engage with more than 1,000 partners across Virginia in a variety of ways. We have a call center. You probably don't know, it's very small, but got 2 or 3 people. But they make about 40,000 plus calls per year to try to set appointments and sort of move to that first step to get engaged with companies. We have more than 8,000 corporate execs and site selection consultants that get our quarterly magazine. We meet with more than 800 prospect meetings every year. We keep up with top site consultants. This year, we actually did more than 100. We also bring in site consultants and media for familiarization tours in Virginia. We generate hundreds of new leads per year. These are companies that have new projects for which Virginia might be considered, and we work in collaboration with our partners to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have several hundred companies enrolled in international trade programs. This is not really a comprehensive view, but I really just wanted to give you a sense that there's an awful lot going on. You think about, the front page announcements, but there's an awful lot more to this work that really goes into producing those outcomes. To give you a sense of how it kind of breaks down across the state, I think you all are familiar with the Go Virginia regions. This was just looking from a business development lens. The last few years, the number of leads we did for each region. A DVA is a decision for Virginia. That means a company decided to place a new investment in Virginia, capital investment in millions, and then the number of new jobs committed. And you can see it sort of varies across the Commonwealth. Northern Virginia in any year is going to be dominant by far just because it is the biggest region by far. And on top of that, in general in the United States, the big metro areas have been winning in a big way. So it would be a really unconventional year if Northern Virginia weren't the biggest. But one of the things we do, again, I don't have time to show you everything today, but we provide a quarterly partner report that goes to the lead economic development professional in every locality in every region of Virginia that shows them not just this data, but all kinds of other data about what we've done to try to bring leads to their region, how that level of activity compares to the population in their area and so forth, and really try to be transparent about the work that we do. In general, you could kind of think of this notion of the lead generation funnel. We've got to target a large number of companies, then multiple people sometimes in each company. You get down to prospect meetings, new lead projects, and then ultimately wins for Virginia. Where do those leads come from? Well, there's several different sources. I think the most common, I think I'm correct in saying by far, is our lead generation efforts. So we have I forget the exact number of people, but it's at least a couple dozen folks that spend part or all of their time trying to identify companies that may be expanding and that might have a project that fits in Virginia. We get some leads directly from companies through our marketing efforts. We get some, of course, from our local and regional partners that are doing their own lead generation. And then, of course, site selection consultants are a really important piece. Roughly half of major economic development projects are advised by a site consultant. So there's a couple hundred folks that are super important that we keep in close touch with there. Additionally, we often will get leads from legislators, from the administration's efforts, from other state agencies. Very important to keep in mind that while we are, I guess, the nominal lead of economic development in Virginia, these other entities play a really critical role and often generate their own leads. VDAX would be a good example of that. We also get leads from universities. So all those go into that funnel. And once we get engaged, we do everything we can to work with our partners to bring those projects to Virginia. To give you a sense of our, sorry, I went too fast there. Give you a sense of our current prospect pipeline. We got about 434 projects we're working on as of June 12th. Roughly half are in manufacturing. And I'd say that's probably relatively typical. Got about 8% supply chain, and then you can see other projects in IT, corporate services, and so forth. Now, bear in mind, this is by the number of projects. If we did it by employment of those, the mix would be a bit different. So corporate services and IT would be considerably bigger. Manufacturing typically would be a little bit smaller. But at any one time, we're working on hundreds of project opportunities. Okay, so shifting now to the competitive landscape. What is it that really drives companies to make decisions to locate one place or another? I've been involved in many, many hundreds of competitive site selection competitions. What you're looking at here is largely my personal perspective, but it's also backed up by, there was a site selection piece a couple of years ago that came to similar conclusions. The factors on the left, and again, this depends on each project, but generally speaking, the factors on the left are the biggest drivers. The quality, availability, and cost of target workforce. This is one of the reasons Virginia does well in general. It's also one of the reasons why smaller regions with smaller populations struggle a bit, because companies on average like to have a bigger labor force to draw from. So we really have to work hard in the smaller regions. Proximity to key customers and suppliers. Another factor that really favors the larger metros, because you have a lot more of that there. Real estate is really critical. The most common reason typically that we lose a project is we just don't have a well-prepared site that's ready to go. There's a number of other factors there, but those are the major ones. If we get into a short list, then you get into a second set of factors, and they're listed here as secondary. That doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that they're usually not the things that drive whether we get on the short list, but once we get on the short list, they become really, really essential. So the availability and quality of customized workforce solutions, incentive offerings, very, very important. One of the most, probably the second most common reason we'll lose a project is if we have a good site and another southern state also has a good site with an attractive business climate, everything else kind of similar, but they offer 3 to 5 times the incentives we do, which is a very common situation. That would be another reason that that we would lose. And there's a number of other factors here, but just important to keep in mind for any particular project, there's usually a bunch of different criteria involved, and we're trying to optimize the case for Virginia across all those. Let's skip through that. Just briefly wanted to touch on when we're not considered or when we lose. We do kind of track this, especially when we're considered but not selected. So if we're not considered, often it's just because the executives involved simply were not aware of Virginia's advantages for their business. So we'll hear, for example, very commonly from site consultants who will say, yes, the company's asked me to pick a location, but they've asked me to, or to help advise them on picking a location, but they've actually helped us they've asked us to advise them to pick a location in one of these 3 to 5 states. Very often Virginia is not on that initial list. So it wasn't like we got considered and eliminated. It was that we were not top of mind for whatever reason for the executives involved. And so they might say, hey, we want the best option among North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. And then we're not even in the game unless we become aware of it. Another common reason we don't get considered, not super common, but I would say probably second to the first, is some companies, particularly those with the most attractive projects, have a general expectation of a relatively robust incentive package. Virginia generally is one of the smallest, has some of the smallest incentives of all of our competitor states. So it doesn't happen super often, but fairly frequently with particularly large competitive manufacturing projects, we can get knocked out based on that. Another reason is that while we have relatively low tax burdens for existing firms, because of the lack of statutory sort of by right tax incentives and credits, we tend to be a relatively higher tax state for new investment. For those that we get considered for, but we're not selected, most common is probably the lack of a suitable site or building. If another state has a prepared site and we don't, it's speed to market. Imagine that you've picked out the car that you want and the options you want. You have 2 dealerships. One dealership has it literally sitting on the lot. The other one says, hey, we can get it for you, but it's going to take 2 months, right? If the price is about the same, you're not even going to wait for the other option. This is the same issue here. If we're competing against a state that has a site with the infrastructure that's ready to go, they have an advantage of 12 to 36 months on Virginia, which means in almost 100% of cases we will lose unless for some reason they just have to be here. So that's a big factor. I mentioned incentives earlier. That's often a factor. And sometimes there's some other specific thing. We're relatively uncompetitive for our machinery and tools taxes and some corporate headquarters projects. There's the market-based sourcing issue. But more often than not, it's either the lack of a prepared site or the size of the incentive offering versus a competitor. I want to just give you a sense of how big of a deal that site issue is. What you're looking at is the number of identified development sites. This, by the way, is the part of the result of the great work that you all enabled us to do with the Site Characterization Initiative. The red part of the bars, these are sites that localities have identified for development that are not ready to be competitive. They would typically take 12 to 18 months or more to be market ready. And that means 90% or more of the time, probably 95% or more of the time, they're simply just not going to make it to the next round. You can see those little slivers of green are actually the competitive sites. So some regions don't have a single green sort of fully competitive site. All of them have a relatively small number, particularly when you look at sites of different size or different configurations. So this is one of Virginia's biggest competitive disadvantages. This is why we were so grateful that you all and the administration supported the site development funding, obviously on hold for obvious reasons, but we were very grateful for that because this is going to be one of the really important things, especially as we think about the future of the smaller metros and rural regions. How we think about incentives in Virginia. I wanted to just share a few principles here. I'm getting toward the end of the deck, by the way. One, but partly because we have such a great story to tell, and partly because overall, and partly because our incentives are so small compared to most of our competitors, we primarily make our case based on Virginia's total value proposition, our location, our talent, our educational institutions, our infrastructure, how well run the state is. And that works pretty well a lot of the time. We typically only use incentives in competitive situations. So imagine a company that says, hey, we've got a new manufacturing project. We might do it in Virginia, but we might do it in North Carolina or Georgia. That would be kind of the scenario. In Virginia, all incentives are performance-based. So companies only receive or keep what they earn. In fact, typically we're providing the incentives post-performance. So they literally don't even get the incentives until they've been earned. Transparent public reporting and post-announcement performance. The announcement is just step one. Once we announce the project, companies are required to report to the Commonwealth on a regular basis how many jobs, what average wage, how much capital investment. If they stay in line or better than what they committed, then everything's great. If they don't, then we either reduce or claw back depending on the structure of the incentive. One of the things that's been a clear message from the General Assembly ever since the JLARC report in 2016, if not before, is robust enforcement of clawbacks. I mean, we are going really hard. We try to work with companies. We want to be very attractive and competitive and business friendly. But if a company does not do what they said they were going to do, then we either get our money back, or if it's post-performance, they don't get as much incentives as they would have, proportionate to their performance. We're typically using incentives to address specific issues like a site preparation issue, a workforce issue. So usually it's not just a cash kind of thing. Second to last, we really make sure that we treat our existing firms the same way as out-of-state firms. So while a lot of our work is around trying to recruit new companies to Virginia, as I mentioned, most of our projects are actually expansions of existing firms, and they can take advantage of those as well. Lastly, I just mentioned HQ2 because we think that's a potential model for the future where we kind of combine potentially a modest incentive with more of a strategic investment that benefits not just that company, but the whole sector, in that case, the Tech Talent Investment Program. Just briefly, as you look at incentives, this is not an analysis we did, but I wanted to share it with you. This was something Jobs Ohio commissioned. And what you're looking at is for typical incentives that were offered, it was a 5-year period, I think 2013 to 2017. The y-axis is incentives as a percentage of capital investment, typical on average, and the x-axis is incentives per job. And what I wanted to point out here is based on their analysis, Virginia offers the lowest incentives per job and the lowest incentives as a proportion of capital investment of any of this competitor set. And most of our key competitors are here. So what does that mean? It basically means two things. One is we typically get a much higher return on investment than the competitor states. But the other obvious thing it means is that a lot of the time we actually lose a project because, a Georgia, a South Carolina, a North Carolina may offer 3, 4, 5, 6 times what we do. And so if we have relatively comparable locations, you see that happen. Senator Ruff, I'm sure, has seen that quite a bit in Southern Virginia, where you'll often, have literally not too many miles away from our site is a North Carolina option. We might offer 3,000 per job. They offer 10,000 per job. If the sites are similar, North Carolina would win in that scenario. Lastly, on incentives, I just wanted to really emphasize, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but there's a whole range of things. We give great credit to JLARC and the General Assembly's work in 2017, all these requirements on due diligence, on public reporting, on incentive collection, on coordinating with other agencies. I mean, we really put a lot of energy into how we administer incentives to make sure it's done in a responsible way, that we minimize the risk of any loss to taxpayer dollars. As far as I know, I don't think we've lost a single dollar since 2017 for anything that wasn't, already in the pipeline, if you will, and also transparent reporting on the back end. Finally, there's just a whole process we go through with each project, and it's due diligence. We do tax forecasting, incentive structuring. We use something that was kind of inspired by credit committees of banks to do a risk evaluation. And then MEI gets involved in the bigger projects. For any project that would involve 10 million or more in total incentives or a change in state law, that has to go to MEI. And then, of course, all the different pieces about negotiating the agreements and then performance tracking after things are announced. And finally, I just wanted to briefly mention 2 last things. I'm running a little bit long on time, so I'm just going to cover one of these and then the future. So creative MEI project wins. Again, we go to MEI on the biggest projects. I think the folks that have been involved have been very proud of the work that we've done together. Obviously, probably the best single example was Amazon, where not only do we win the project, but we won it for far less incentives than almost any other competitor, any other serious competitor. And we had a really unique approach that's going to benefit the entire tech sector, as well as for hundreds of thousands of folks in the region that will benefit from the transportation infrastructure investments. There have been other similar types of unique efforts with Merck in the Valley, where we leveraged Blue Ridge Community College and JMU to really build the pipeline of talent for them and for other companies in the life sciences area. Volvo was another recent project where we created a creative solution that allowed the company to have operational flexibility to move up and down a little bit as it needs to meet customer demand, while still going up, overall, but making sure that it's always in line with that our incentives are always in line with the actual performance that they deliver. Lastly, I just wanted to briefly touch on the future. We don't have time today to go through an in-depth briefing on the impact of COVID-19, although it's obviously been very significant in Virginia. But one of the things that we're giving a lot of thought to is recovery. And I think that you would probably all agree that no matter how much the federal government does, no matter how much Virginia does, we are going to be looking at a tail of unemployment that is going to take some period of time past 2020, maybe into 2022, maybe even 2023. And we want to make that tail as short as it can possibly be. We see 4 significant opportunities that are out there. One is to capture new manufacturing, reshoring, and supply chain opportunities. There is some sense that, hard to say exactly how big it's going to be, but that some jobs are going to go back. Some manufacturing supply chain opportunities are going to shift closer to where the customers are. So in general, that would mean less in Asia, more in North America. That's a big opportunity for us to go after with our custom workforce program, with site development efforts. Second, accelerating digital Virginia. For those in Northern Virginia, you're one of the powerhouse regions in the country and the world, but also other parts of Virginia, Charlottesville, the greater Richmond area, Hampton Roads, Southwest Virginia, Southern Virginia. Big opportunities in cloud computing, software, cybersecurity, data centers. The Tech Town Investment Program is going to make a big impact there, as will the broadband investments you all have made. Third is telework. Telework was actually one of the fastest growing employment growth sectors even before the pandemic. Obviously, it's going to be bigger than it was before. This is something that really plays into Virginia's strengths as a place with great weather, great quality of life, great public education institutions, and so forth. It raises some new issues and challenges in terms of how we market Virginia, and it means broadband is really even more important than it was before, but we see that as a significant opportunity. And then finally, retooling and reskilling our unemployed workforce. Low skill workers or less educated workers, women, racial minorities were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. I think to a large extent that those same populations are going to face the longest road back. And we're largely talking about folks in hospitality and retail, although there are other sectors that are impacted as well. So think about things like the G3 initiative, the Virginia Jobs Investment Program, the Virginia Talent Accelerator Program, all things that you all have recently committed dollars to, we think are exactly the right things to move Virginia forward in the wake of the pandemic. So I covered a lot there. I hope you were able to follow me. I didn't talk too fast. Again, really appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys today. Looking forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and all the members, as well as with the MEI Commission that several of you will be sitting on. Excited to be here in Virginia, excited about our future, even though we're facing some real challenges right now, and would welcome any questions or comments you all may have for me.
Yeah, Stephen Dick Saslaw. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You emphasized quite a bit that we don't offer the incentives that other people did, and you touched on the example where it didn't seem to matter, and that's what I wanted to ask about. With respect to Amazon, we offered what? The total deal was what? $2 billion, something like that?
Well, to the company was $550 million, and then we
them. But Montgomery County, Maryland offered $8 billion. New Jersey offered $8 billion. Yet they settled on us.
Right. There's
got to be some attraction.
So
there comes the lack of incentives.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think in general the fact that incentives are relatively modest in Virginia has not been a major challenge for Northern Virginia. I think it's a big challenge for rural Virginia and small metro Virginia, and the reason is that those regions are, while they're wonderful places to live with great people, great institutions and all that, as a site consultant or a company is looking at one of those regions, in general, they're going to feel less differentiated. And if you look at Northern Virginia, where you've got, one of the most educated populations in the country, DC Metro is literally the #1 producer of tech graduates in North America, or in the world, I think. There were some enormous strengths that the region had, and of course, other things we talked about, quality of life, the Virginia business climate, and so forth. When you look at the smaller metros and the rural regions, that's where that competition is more intense. That's where we've been more commonly losing projects over incentive issues, because you kind of end up with two places. It's sort of like, to use my car analogy, you picked out the car you want, the options you want, and you've got two dealerships that both offer basically the same thing, but one of them offers it to you for $1,000 less. That's basically the challenge that we face.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from the committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ruff.
I'm glad to hear you say that we were looking at companies that would like to reshore to the area, and that is a good long-term solution. But what about the manufacturing in the short term, where our current manufacturers have been getting parts needed to complete their product from the Far East, and they're just things are not coming through the way they should? Are we looking at those short-term solutions?
Yes, sir. And that actually is largely the catalyst for that reshoring effort. So, I would say this is a slight oversimplification, but for the last 20 or 30 years, much of what has driven offshoring of manufacturing has just been cost, right? Well, what's happened since that time is, the wage rates have ramped up, logistics costs have ramped up. So the cost disadvantages are not quite what they were. Additionally, manufacturing is becoming more capital intensive, less people intensive. So that while there are fewer jobs, they tend to be better jobs. But what's now happened since the pandemic is that companies have become more aware that they've got to really think about supply chain risk as well, right? And so if you have a company if you've got your supply chain, sort of broken up across the world, there's a risk that you have exactly the challenge that you highlighted, Senator, which has impacted many of our companies in your region and beyond, that they're not able to get the parts they need to actually complete production. So that is a big part of what we think is, at least for some companies, going to drive more of those companies to move more operations closer to where the customers are, not just for the finished goods, but for their, the suppliers on down the chain. We've identified, I may get this number off, I think approximately 1,500 companies that we think were most likely to have this kind of shift, and have reached out to all of them. Now, companies are still sort of, they're sort of reeling still from what's going on with all the uncertainty in the economy. And it's still too early to tell how big of a shift will this be. And let's say we get a vaccine in this, in early, maybe 2021. Do things kind of go back to normal, or do you really see a permanent shift? But we're trying to identify and really build relationships now with all the companies that are likely, or that we think could be likely to have that kind of shift. And then we'll be well positioned to be able to take advantage of it. How big it will be, I just don't know yet. I hope I answered your question, Senator.
I did. It does. It is going to be a short-term concern about how we get finished products ready for the market. Another point is, and you brought it up, is the fact that most of our competition for manufacturing is from the south of us.
That's correct.
We are the farthest north state that is right to work. There's legislation this year to end that. And I suspect that it's going to come back up next year. If it does, how is that going to affect us in the future?
I think we could think about right to work in two different ways. One is we could have a debate about the merits of it. Just, is it a policy that makes sense? And I would obviously leave that to you all and others. What I have observed in my experience, and literally working many hundreds of manufacturing projects, is that for the manufacturing sector, now it doesn't tend to be, my sense is it's not as big of a deal for other industry sectors, or for most other industry sectors, but for manufacturing, there's a large percentage of manufacturers that will either only consider right to work states or will heavily weight that as a factor when they choose where to locate. It's hard to say exactly what the percentage is, but I certainly would be comfortable saying it's 30 to 50%. I think it would be close to 50%, give or take. And you can see that in surveys of site consultants, of corporate executives, not every manufacturer, but it's a very large percentage. It's also a very large percentage of the really big projects like the automotive assembly facilities and so forth that will only consider, right to work state. So, I just think as we think about manufacturing, remember the chart I showed you all before that showed, most of the new job opportunities that we've been able to attract outside of the Crescent and this, rural regions, smaller metros of Virginia have been in manufacturing. I think it'd be fair to say that, roughly half or a little less than half of those would be highly sensitive to a right to work policy decision.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Is that Senator Barker?
Yes, Stephen, good to hear from you here today. I assume that since you haven't been coming to talk to us a lot the last several months, that you've been getting all kinds of things done. So, but which I look on as good news there. Given over the last several years here in Virginia, after basically a 75-year run where we outperformed the national economy and our population was growing faster than the national population growth rates, we've been lagging a little bit. We're coming back, narrowing some of the gaps, at least on the economic side. We're still not on the population side of it. Only grew by 20,000 last year between 2018 and 2019. And we're struggling, and part of the reason for it is things have fallen off in Northern Virginia. We've not had the growth rates either in population or in economic production that we had for decades, actually. And part of the issue that we run into is that we have a lot of companies and a lot of CEOs who have some ideas that they are convinced are good ideas, but they've had difficulty being able to recruit the highly skilled trained workforce to be able to fill those jobs. With Amazon coming down, Micron, others sort of beginning to provide some basis for resurgence up here. What's your view of where we are and how we're going to get to where we want to be to drive some of those things and in effect, not only improve things in Northern Virginia, but turn around things for Virginia as a whole? Yeah,
thank you, Senator Barker. I'm going to give you a short answer, not because I can't give you a long one, but I just want to make sure I don't take up the rest of the time. But I think the first thing I would say is and I can't say I've looked at every single historical period, but when I was first looking to move or to be considered for the job at VDP, one of the things I analyzed was Virginia's historic growth patterns and how that varied by region. And one of the interesting things that I found was that I forget how far back you have to go, 10 or 15 years, but back when Virginia was really putting up some really good growth numbers, there were many years that Northern Virginia was growing rapidly and the rest of Virginia on average was actually losing jobs or losing population or both at the same time. And so the point being, it's just really an emphasis to your point that I think when we look back to where we were before, I think it's been a very long time since Virginia as a whole was experiencing rapid growth. Each region rather of Virginia.
Right.
There were times when the average was pretty good because Northern Virginia was doing so well, and as you highlighted, largely because of the link to the federal government. So, what's happened since then? I think with a combination of BRAC plus and sequestration plus, one thing unfortunately that's ramped up over the last 20 or 30 years is cost of living in Northern Virginia, which like other expensive metros can put somewhat of a damper on growth. So you end up with a lot of really, really good jobs. So that's great, but you don't quite get the same level of growth, and that's a really tough nut to crack. I mean, when you look at some of those other sort of superstar metros, if you will, not all of them are experiencing rapid growth. So what are things that we need to do? Well, some of them are economic development related, some of them are not. I think a lot of it is affordable housing, huge issue. We could debate how much of that is a state issue versus a local or regional issue, but I think that's a big factor. Transportation infrastructure is really big, although I think you guys have largely tackled that, but obviously a lot of it's still yet to be implemented. I think attracting more activity that's not indexed to the federal government. That's one of the reasons we went so aggressively after the Amazon HQ2 project, is it was predominantly not a federal government related opportunity. We really need to get more of a private sector based growth. But the blueprint, if you will, for the rest of Virginia, or for most of the rest of Virginia, is really different. I mean, Virginia, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, really wasn't that competitive outside of Northern Virginia. I think for the rest of Virginia, you think about things like marketing, like site development. We've got to have more prepared sites for the manufacturing projects. I think continuing the investments you all have made in things like G3, Fast Forward, the custom workforce initiatives, huge. It's huge statewide, but it's especially important, in those smaller regions. And then different things that we can do to improve the competitiveness of different industry sectors, broadband investment. I mean, you've heard a lot of these things before. I think to a large extent, Virginia is kind of either doing these things or at least in the direction of doing these things that I think will make a big difference. I think it's mostly staying the course, but we do have to keep in mind that in general, the smaller metros and the rural regions nationwide, are challenged. It's in general, the big metros are winning. In our case, our biggest metro is winning, but it's because it's so overweighted to the federal government, it's not having the kind of growth that some of the more private sector centric places are. I'm sorry, I rambled a little bit, but those are some of the things that certainly come to mind for me.
Thank you.
Other questions from the committee? Well, great. One question I had, Stephen, I noticed in your the list of sort of industries and businesses that were focused on, that biotech was not there. Was that covered under in there somewhere that I just missed it because of the labeling of it?
I think it was, and maybe if it wasn't, it was left off on accident. But I'll try to get back there. There we go. Let's see. Yeah, there is life sciences.
Life sciences.
So we have biotech in there, but I do want to be candid with you all. We don't. It's not. We've got some really unique assets there for sure, but we're well behind. Maryland, Boston, San Diego, some of those big areas. That's a sector where there's really just the critical mass factor is such a huge driver. It's somewhat similar to tech, although with tech, it is easier to attract opportunities in smaller areas if you have a pipeline of talent like what you all are doing with the Tech Talent Investment Program. But when we did our planning in 2017, we definitely see this as an important sector for Virginia. But if you were to compare it to, say, the tech sector, we think the tech sector would be at least 10 times, the size of the opportunity realistically for what we can attract here. There definitely will be some nice opportunities that we're going to get, and we want to be as supportive of those companies as we can. But from a critical mass perspective, we're just not nearly as competitive there as we are in tech.
That's because Marion has Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, that's one example.
Yeah. Stephen, would the project going on that's still in development, but they are up and running in Northern Virginia at Innova, the Genomics Center, taking over the old ExxonMobil and what have you, how big of a driver is that likely to be in terms of attracting life sciences, biotech, those kinds of things? Do you track that, or is that something that's already up and running and you'll deal with aspects of that as they come up, but that you don't have much, you're not heavily engaged in it?
No, we actually see that the Innova site there, the former ExxonMobil site, as one of the most attractive development locations in Northern Virginia. The other one that we put even more attention on is the Innovation Station site. You all just sold the Commonwealth sold the CIT building to the developer there that's looking to develop that site and the adjoining properties. We think both of those are very, very attractive. I think UVA's involvement in the Innova site is going to be very strategic. And I think one of the things, even though I say we may not be quite where we'd like to be in life sciences and biotech, but the one place that we can be the world leader is exactly where much of that industry is going, and that is in data science, right? We've got these wonderful things happening at UVA, at William & Mary, at Virginia Tech, and beyond in data science. And it's that merger of data science and life sciences where a lot of the magic is happening right now. And so that's the kind of opportunity that we're hoping to really cultivate on the Innova campus. We actually, but for the pandemic, we would have done some planning exercises we'd planned with the leadership there at Innova and UVA just before the pandemic got underway. So once we get further along here, we're going to re-engage with that. And we definitely see that as a big opportunity for growth.
Okay. The one last question that I had, Stephen, is sort of put you on the spot here, but something like the pandemic coming along with the economic challenges that come along with it, the political strife that we're going through around what happened in Minneapolis, and the need to correct a lot of social problems in the United States. Where do you see our biggest speed bumps, and where do you think all of this turmoil and what have you could lead to sort of the slingshot effect of really moving us along faster than we might have ordinarily, because old business opportunities don't seem as attractive as taking the gamble on leaping quickly into the future around things like automated electric autonomous vehicles, driverless, that type thing, shared vehicles, that type thing. What are your political strife that we're going through around
Senator, I think that's a great
to correct a lot of social problems.
Sorry, there's some reverb. Senator, it's a great question. It's such a difficult time that we're, I think, dealing with as a country as we try to come to grips with that legacy of racism in the United States. I do think that, at least relative to Northern Virginia, there's a big advantage because of the diversity of the tech workforce there is quite high compared to many around the country. That was actually one of the big selling points that we emphasized with Amazon, and we were recruiting them to Virginia. I just think in general, this may not be an exact direct answer to your question, but I think broadly speaking, the states that win in economic development in the future are going to be those that do the best job at developing and retaining talent, right? And particularly as you think about knowledge-based jobs, enabling people to get the training that they need to be able to get high-wage jobs will be, I think, a huge factor in improving equity, improving inclusion, and so forth. And I think some of the programs that you all have recently shown support for, to me, really help in that direction. And that would, and certainly when you think about in sectors, you think about advanced manufacturing, you think about technology, cybersecurity, software development, data centers, data science. These are all things that I think could really be key pieces of an effort to move toward, an era of greater equity and inclusion. I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure I followed it exactly.
Well, I think as best as anybody could answer that question, it is, I just happen to think that at this point in time, ordinarily in a recession, people look at kind of trying to resume where they left off when the recession started, and kind of tweaking what they were doing and trying to move forward. But as to whether something as dramatic as what we're going to go through right now, that some of the capital and a lot of the investment is going to go to next generation kinds of things that can be done through 5G, that can be done through massive changes in our transportation, which with a lot of those things, that will really, I think, drive where people feel comfortable in living, where the opportunities will develop as we change some of the structures around earnings for people. Just with simple things like getting the minimum wage up, is that areas will become more attractive to people, and that we can attract jobs to the Southwest and South side of Virginia where we've struggled. But that maybe some of this will as painful as it is, will create some real opportunity into the future if we're willing to sort of take the risk.
I think there's potential for that. And by the way, I agree with a lot of those specific sectors you mentioned. I mean, autonomous systems, unmanned systems, this is a huge leadership opportunity for Virginia. I think transportation innovation is something we already are doing great work in with our state transportation secretariat and VDOT and the folks that are working on the rail projects and so forth. I think overall, we have our next issue of our magazine is all about the future of America and Virginia post-pandemic. And we've reached out to some of the top thinkers in the country. And one of the things that was obvious to me is that Virginia is pretty well positioned. I mean, you think about remote work being a bigger factor, you think about data centers, you think about all the technologies involved in that. We're a leader in all of that right now. A lot of the technologies of the future, Virginia is already easily in the top 5, if not in the number 1 or 2 spot. So I'm pretty bullish, but I also think we've got to keep working hard, especially for our smaller metros and rural regions where, the formula for success is still a little bit elusive, but we know what some of our competitors have done that has worked, and there's some of those things that we can replicate here in Virginia. We've started doing that.
Stephen, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the members of the committee? Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Charles, and the folks at Senate Finance, Chairman Howell, for your participation today, and want to thank especially you, Stephen, and your staff for putting this together for us and briefing us. I think there's going to be some real challenges coming up in the special session to sort of set the ship on a sustainable course, and then in our next session in 2021, making the plans to move into the future. And I just don't know that it's quite as predictable as it used to be, but I have great confidence in you and your staff, and I think we all do. And I think we've got a team in place in Virginia that can make things happen. So without further ado, I guess we'll adjourn the meeting. And I think Senator Howell has us back up in a Senate Finance Committee meeting. When is that, Janet? I think that's tomorrow?
9:30.
9:30 tomorrow.
Oh, it's 9:30.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So this
There's
is
a Zoom opportunity.
Thank you all very much.
Make sure you send me the link,
Thank you,
April.
Mr. Chairman.
I've got it ready to go, Senator Saslaw.
Yeah.
And I'm sending a reminder to everybody else too. Thank you.
Thanks, April. Take care now, everybody.